Welcome, folks, to The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Every week, diving deep into the truth of Catholic social teaching and restoring all things in Christ.
The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
I'm Dr. Bud Marr.
We are coming to you live from these United States of America. Me, Bo Bonner, over here in Des Moines, Iowa, where I'm the Director of Mission and Ministry for the Mercy College of Health Sciences and Director of the Zeta Institute for Foundation and Ethics and Leadership. You can find us at mchs.edu and zetainstitute.com. Bud, what do you do out there in Pittsburgh for all the folks listening?
I am the Director of Scouting and Child Care for the Pittsburgh Steelers, keeping any unruly wide receivers in line.
That's right.
No, I direct. I direct here. I'm doing a terrible job with it.
Yeah.
I'm director at the National Institute for Newman Studies, and you can find more at newmanstudies.org. Do you say org or org?
I say both in rapid succession. Org. So.
Because org makes us sound like a cult. Like I think the Scientologists they ride the Sea Org across the seas.
You've been watching too many documentaries. So getting away from documentaries and orgs and everything like that. It's actually for once. Let me ask, Bud, is it actually sun shining where you're at right now?
No, it's a classic cloudy.
Okay, well, but it's not raining.
We're not. Well, it's gonna rain.
Okay. Well,
we're a couple days behind you guys.
That's right. I was gonna argue that, like, for once, we're having a radio show, and it's not currently raining enough to make people that I know and love concerned about flooding. So that's been really nice. I was out of the middle of the country. We brought students out to the United Nations for the Sisters of Mercy. So Mercy College, who underwrites our show, one of the things that we got a chance to do is every 2 years you get to send students to be with the Sisters of Mercy. They have a permanent observer status at the United Nations, and they sort of take students around, show them what they do, what they advocate for. But we also happen to bring with us tornadoes. So Staten Island actually had 2 tornadoes while we were in New York, and they had not had that for a long time. So we're just sharing gifts, Bud. It's just, different parts of the country sharing with each other.
Your guys' weather has been insane. You had that frigid winter, and now I hear you've got like a Noah's Ark scenario on. So
yeah, and there's been quite a few tornadoes in Iowa. I'm also just thinking about family back home in Oklahoma, where there has been the whole gamut of everything. But people getting out their boats, using boats more than they realize. But it's also kind of crazy when you see all the floodwaters, you think it's never going to go away, and then it's pretty impressive about how nature can get back doing nature. Same thing probably out with Nebraska. You talk to your friends and family out there. I'm sure it seemed like it would never not be a lake again, but sounds like people are trying to recover, and mostly things have receded in a lot of places.
Yeah, well, with you saying that, Bo, I feel like there really is something that's theologically not inspiring, that draws to mind theological ideas when you experience weather like that, because it really does, even in this modern world where we have technology that controls so many aspects of our life. There's so many things that we can avoid that humans in the past couldn't avoid. Nature has a way of reminding us that we're not ultimately in charge. And it also, I think this spring I've been kind of pushed to prayer because a lot of people are dealing with, if you've ever experienced like water in your basement, flooding of an entire town has to be some serious labor to recover from.
No, that's exactly right. I also, it brought to my mind that it shows how much we are incarnational and regional creatures, because to see people out in New York talk about tornadoes and not really understanding in any way whatsoever what's involved with watching out for tornadoes, what you do. So, for instance, I bet you never thought about this, but if a tornado were to hit the island of Manhattan, what they tell you to do is go in the subway, which you're like, oh yeah, that makes sense, like an entire underground city where, presumably the tornadoes can't get you. So I went to announce my big initiative, which is a subway throughout all of the Midwest, just mostly for tornadoes and less for travel. So that should be really inexpensive, right?
That's right. Well, the one virtue of Pittsburgh is it's supposedly the lowest rate of natural disasters for any major city in the country. So
we've got
that going for us.
And we roll into sports jokes on that one, right? So,
yeah.
Bam. Yeah, okay. Like we were talking about, we were brought to you, underwritten always by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Like I said, got to do wonderful things with the students, go out, do things like the United Nations trip, people going to the Yucatan. For a small college, we sure as heck make sure to get people out and about in the world, and even if you're here and not going on one of our planned trips out of the state, we make sure to get you throughout the city of Des Moines. We want you to be able to go in there and experience what life is in the clinicals. mchs.edu, our summer programs have really gotten off to a start, but you can start in fall, spring, or summer, mchs.edu.
Well, in all seriousness, like this is the time of year where we start talking with students about some of their service learning. And I'm a firm believer that a place like Mercy, it's not like something they sprinkle on top of what they do. There's always conversations taking place there about how Mercy is a neighbor to the rest of the community and what that looks like. It's not, like we can't sacrifice the good for the sake of perfection, but I know as the director of mission, you've got the ball rolling in a lot of great directions.
Well, I think this really works out for what we're going to talk about with the show today. We want to talk about charity itself, and especially the difference between philanthropy, often understood, and what we would call the theological paradigm in which charity and almsgiving takes place. It's not that those are two necessarily absolutely opposed, but certainly there are different regimes of thought when it comes to what are we doing when we try to give to the poor. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We will be doing that right after we get back from these messages. So stick around for Dr. Bud Marr. I'm Bo Bonner. We'll be back right after this break. We're back with the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. So, Bud, like we came out of the commercial talking about, charity. So, obvious, it's easy to talk about one show and really try to point out how wonderful a charity it is. The one time where you get to brag and say that there's something that we're happy that we get to do. But, of course, we're serious about this. We wouldn't be here doing Iowa Catholic Radio or the Uncommon Good if we didn't think there was a way in which we were participating in the love of God, and that's what charity is, the love of God, the virtue of charity that is enacted in several different ways throughout the world, not only in our Iowa Catholic Radio listeners or Oklahoma or people listening on the radio, but in several ways that we begin to enact God's love towards one another. So that technically in theology is called charity. There's also the idea of charity in the much wider sense in which people give to charity, or they think about giving to someone in need and calling that charity. In the old sort of fashion of the church, that'd be called almsgiving. And how does that square with something like donating to something that you care a lot about? We hear the word philanthropy, right? So philos, love, anthropos, humans. So philanthropy literally just means love of our fellow humans, and that we give out of our abundance to different sort of people. Now, Bud, when we were talking about this show, I think you were really pointing out, though, that in modern parlance, it seems to be that the word philanthropy and almsgiving, even if they both broadly fit under charity, that they start to highlight either different things entirely or at least different lenses in which we see similar acts. So with that in mind, what is it that either made you think about this, or how do you want to start out people thinking about this difference between philanthropy and almsgiving?
Well, one thing that's fascinating to me is that historically charity was seen as a theological virtue. And when we talk about, the Bible doesn't posit a ton of things directly about God's character, because I think the biblical authors recognize that God's deeply mysterious, and so he's unlike, anything we experience immediately in our world. But the book of John, and then later in John's epistles, he says God is love. And so love, or caritas, seems to be at the center of the Christian faith. And yet, Bo, maybe you haven't experienced this as much, but I know for myself sometimes, especially talking to younger people, it's strange because in our context, charity has sometimes come to take on negative connotations. Like, I don't know, there's this kind of idea that, like, you can show charity to someone but not really care about them, like throwing money at them as a way to kind of dismiss or walk by without it really impinging upon your own existence.
You'll also hear people get called a charity case, and this is supposedly negative as well. But yes, keep going.
Interesting. Yeah, and so we tend to, and I honestly, Bo, on today's show, I'm kind of teasing some of these out in my own mind, and part of my inspiration for the show is I was like, I'm going to have Bo figure out this problem for me.
No pressure.
In our time, philanthropy, I think, is for the most part really praised. So we look at people in our society who give a lot of money, and you've already mentioned that our radio show and, of course, like the work that I do is dependent upon those who have been blessed in a number of ways and then give generously out of their abundance. But I think it's worth, as Catholics, asking, we don't have to be neurotic about this, but how do we embody charity, and how do we give in such a way that it's changing us, and it's actually attentive to what's going on around us? And so, do you want me to keep going, or do you have a few thoughts? I have a couple things in mind.
Well, I want to veer off. Since you threw down the gauntlet of figuring this all out for you, I feel that I have every right to take a side rabbit hole here. When we get the idea that charity might have a negative sense, either it's dismissive, I give to charity and I don't care about people, or don't treat me like I'm a charity case. One thing that I think is interesting is we especially have the negative connotations when we get to the word pity. Don't pity me, don't pity other people. The idea that we should have pity on anyone in the modern world is especially looked down upon. I actually think this has everything to do with the distinction you're trying to make. So when Thomas Aquinas is talking about mercy specifically, you would think that what he's going to talk about, I don't know, there's a whole host of things when we think about mercy. You know, Mercy College underwrites our show. Mercy is very much appealed to. What do we mean by mercy? He immediately begins to talk about pity, in that the good it is to pity people who are in pitiable situations. Now, Bud, when you hear pity yourself, before we go into it, what comes to mind to you, and what do you think, if you told a group of students that one of your goals in life is to pity people, how do you think they would react to that?
Yeah, I think in that case, it's clearly something seen as negative, and I think the reason why is that if you think about the term applied as an adjective, to see someone as pitiable, it almost gives the connotation that you're somehow above or in a different or better position than the person you're helping.
Now, what is interesting, and I think that's exactly right, what's crazy when you think about this, another sort of side, walking down a side path that hopefully clarifies this. So Aristotle, when he's talking about what makes good art, so he says, you know, what when we have a poem, what should poetry do? And he's specifically talking about tragedies. And he said a good tragedy evokes fear and pity in us. So fear that we would end up like the person in the tragic situation, and pity for the character who has ended up in that situation as well. So for Aristotle, when it comes to the very nature of art, if you can't pity one of the characters in the art that's taking place, then the art is only spectacle. And spectacle belongs, I don't want to go too far down this road, but it's only spectacle if you can't pity one of the people that are in the play, which begins to show that pity is sort of one of the most basic ways that we can empathize. That's a word that everybody really loves, is empathy. How are you going to empathize someone if we, from the very beginning, strike out the necessity of pitying people? And so this starts to get at, I think, the idea of the distinction that you're trying to get at. We want to say everybody is sort of self-controlled, everyone is an atomistic individual. To pity someone is to either be paternalistic or to strip them of their dignity or their worth. But if we get back to the most ancient understandings of pity, which someone like Thomas Aquinas in the Church gets at, we pity people precisely because we can put ourselves where they're at and realize that we ourselves would pray that we wouldn't be in those situations. And this very basic notion, right, that we make distinctions about those who are weak or in distress or need our help relies on pity. And I think that starts to be the problem, is if we think something like pity or charity is automatically against human dignity, you can start to see how this problem that I think you're pointing at, Bud, begins to happen, and then we have really weird understandings of mercy and charity.
Well, and one thing I've realized in my own life, and if I could go back and teach students directly that servant leadership course, that I would challenge them with is I think sometimes there's a way we can get paralyzed by our concerns that we're doing something right. I think, and part of developing a kind of habit of where we're not clinging to the gifts that God has given us is just to, the only way you can start with detachment is by actually making concrete sacrifices, you know? And I was really challenged by this in the life of someone like Mother Teresa, where I think she recognized that sometimes, especially those maybe in the West, they were concerned about how do we solve the entire problem, but love has to be embodied. And so she would say things like, you may not be able to feed 100 people, but if you can't feed 100, then just feed one. And not all of us can do great things, but we can do small things with great love. So I don't want to sentimentalize or give the impression that, well, just do your part. There's a way, again, that we use that phrase in our context, and it's kind of just a pithy saying, and we can ignore the sort of like broader structural issues. But there's something to be said where if you say, am I doing this whole charity thing right, and you pass 10 homeless people in 1 week and never pause to give it all, you're probably sacrificing the concrete love that's in front of you for like the theoretical.
I think that there's plenty of versions of this throughout different parts of literature, and so I don't know. Putting it all together immediately here on the spot, I'm going to miss out. But I think that we can all think of characters for whom the idea, the sort of abstraction of being someone who really cares about humanity is something that's really appealing to them. But dealing with the sort of dirty person in front of us in need can seem actually very frightening. To make too much of a point, and I know that there would be plenty of people who will take me to task for making too much of this, but I do think that starts to be part of the distinction. When we talk about philanthropy, again, I'm not talking about actually if you give to charity. There's all sorts of charities coming up that need your help. We obviously are making our summer appeal. Later this week, I'm going to the Inner Visions Gala. There's obviously people who need what we call philanthropy. I do think it's interesting that we call charity no longer almsgiving, and we do call it philanthropy. Again, philos means love. That's where we get philosophy from, or Philadelphia. And anthropos is humanity. Philanthropy loves humanity, and I think too often abstractly. So we love humanity in general, and then we take that abstraction, okay, I love humanity in general, and then I'm like, well, where am I going to sort of throw money at a problem to show that I love humanity in general? Now, again, I really want to point out what I'm not advocating is you stop giving money to charities. What I'm trying to point out, I think, is what you're saying, that when you have the idea that the reason we give money is because we have this general love of humanity, there's a way in which you can sanitize the charity that you give. The reason almsgiving, I think, gets at a more ancient, medieval, Catholic understanding of charity, even though it's doing the same thing, giving money, the idea is, as much as possible, if you can put the money or the food in someone's hands, you can't escape their humanity. You have to see them in their individual humanity, and you can't pity the entire world, but you can have pity on a particular person, and that pity can lead you to mercy, which is charity. So one more time for Thomas Aquinas, what is pity? Pity is sympathy for another's distress. It is directed, properly speaking, towards another. And he even points out that one can't really even have pity on themselves except figuratively, right? Just like you can't have justice in a real specific way to yourself, you have it towards others. So just as properly speaking, a man does not pity himself, but suffers in himself, as when we suffer cruel treatment in ourselves. So too in the case of those who are so closely united to us as to be part of ourselves, such as our children or our parents, we do not pity their distress, but suffer as from our own sores. So what he's getting at here, right, is that pity is the emotion that makes us treat people who are not ourselves or our own as our own. And I think this might be initially why some people are worried about pity, because pity does admit that you aren't, like this person is not me, and they're not my closest groups, right? So like when my child suffers, I actually suffer too. I don't have pity on my child. Their suffering is tied up with mine. But we can't do that automatically with all humanity, but we can start to grow that actual suffering with others. So pity is the beginning of having sympathy, compassion with someone else, and eventually those who would pity others would eventually see a wider group included in the group of people that I don't no longer only pity them, but I suffer with them. And I think that starts to be what we're getting at, but there's a way in which when you start to feel pity, and I think that's another distinction needs to be made. You know, for Aristotle and people like Thomas, your emotions, you don't have total control over them. You can control how you deal with them, but the emotion that comes up is not necessarily up to you. We don't really have complete control whether we're scared or not. The question is, what do we do once we feel fear? Pity is something similar. Pity can be trained, right? I can have a more fleshy heart that is easier. You know, I've made it where I have pity on more people, but largely I don't make myself have pity. It's if I'm aware of pitiable situations or not. But when I do have pity, the question starts to be, what am I going to do about it? And I think what you're getting at, Bud, is philanthropy, again, not in the actual part of giving money to people, but in sort of the abstraction of itself. If we have abstract love for humanity, when we begin to feel pity, if money is a way to stop the feeling of pity, then we're doing it for the wrong reason. And I think that's what you're getting at if you want an answer. We begin to feel pity. If we write the check to kill that feeling, then we're undermining why God put pity as one of our emotions in the first place. But if pity draws us to that person, makes us try to think of ways that we can assuage the pain they have because of the sympathy we have, and if we further follow pity down until we begin to have mercy on people, we'll begin to have a wider network of people in which we no longer pity them, but we actually share their pain. I think that's the distinction that we're getting at. What do we do with the money that we either call philanthropy or charity or almsgiving? And the more abstract you giving money is, the more likely it is that what you're doing is trying to kill the emotion of pity instead of actually stoking pity to attach you to this person that God has put in our hearts so that we care about others.
Yeah, and one thing that drew me to the Catholic faith several years ago was the way that the Church, I think, brings some of these ideas together and doesn't sacrifice one side of the tension for the other. So I'm thinking of the idea, you think about something like our radio program, and you say, how does this fit into this understanding of giving that you have in mind? Well, the Church has always recognized that there's the corporal works of mercy, which are absolutely essential and commanded by Christ, but then there's also the spiritual works of mercy, and so preaching the gospel, admonishing sinners, that's just as much a part of the faith as the almsgiving that we're called to. And then another piece that I think comes into play is that we're the mystical body of Christ, and so different persons have different gifts. And that doesn't excuse us necessarily from, we all should be called to give out of the abundance of what we have and to be attentive to the needs of the poor. Christ is up front that when we encounter the poor, that it's a sacrament of His presence, and what we do on behalf of the least of these, that will redound into our heavenly experience. But there are, I'm grateful, I have individuals in mind, I don't want to say them by name on the radio, but those who have been very successful at doing good work in the business world and have given greatly, and there's something to be said for them empowering. We have to have a certain level of prudence in how we go about our charitable acts. And so on one level, it wouldn't make sense for someone like myself necessarily to move to, say, a part of town that had some very serious issues and to try to run, a whole school there and neglect necessarily like the needs of my family. But thank God, like in the church, we have religious brothers and sisters and priests and those consecrated celibates who have been able to take on certain sacrifices that maybe a young parent isn't able to do without and still do justice to the rest of their responsibilities.
Yeah, well, I'll name names like John Leonetti here. Like the Lord obviously made him to raise money. I'm looking at what like he helped do for the summer appeal.
Is John Leonetti in studio?
No, I'm looking at the
see.
ZipWhip line and see where people have actually, donated. Always remember, folks, 515-223-1150. If you send me, thank you, good job. If you send me running around to raise money, you might end up with a deficit of money. You'd be like, Bo, you were supposed to go out and raise money. Why do we owe people $75 now? And I'd be like, well, there was a sale on Philly cheesesteaks, and we all got hungry. And
taco trucks are the best way to draw a big crowd.
Right. So, God gives us several gifts, and not finances are mine. But I think
you have to know those things though, because if someone like you or I goes in guns blazing with asking for money, it might, like you said, it might end up being worse than when it started.
That's right. Or, if either anybody's like, hey, Bo and Bud, can you fix our engine? And we would say, no, we cannot. We'll go track down someone who can, but you should not let us raise money or rely on our mechanical prowess. With that, Bud, we're getting ready to come up to the break. We want to laud exactly the people who make it possible for us to have this ministry. So that's why we have commercial breaks. But also, this is the summer operational appeal. So if you are so inclined, please go online to look at the donate button, or you can donate by calling 515-223-1150 or texting us as well. This is The Uncommon Good. We'll be back right after these messages. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr coming to you this Wednesday. So, Bud, we're talking about charity, almsgiving, philanthropy, and maybe the distinctions between all of those. I don't think Bud realized this in the show, but I threw in a good old dose of pity, rightly understood, to make us understand what we're doing with that, and then also mercy, which makes sense, of course, as always. We're underwritten by Mercy College of Health Sciences, and the Sisters of Mercy certainly color the way that we look at this show and our understanding of the common good that we're talking to you. Now, Bud, just to get autobiographical, I'm just wondering, is there any sort of consideration that you were mulling over that made you think about this when it came up for a topic of a show, or did you see a poster that said something about charity and you're like, there we go, that's what we're going to talk about today?
Well, I think the idea for the show came up for me because this is an area that I struggle with. I'm kind of tight-fisted, and so recently I've just been, I think, challenged by different things in my life. When we were teaching together, there was a visitor who came to our class, and he shared a quotation, and I don't know if this quote stuck with you, but it's something that I've continued. It challenged me. I don't know if I agree 110%, or I have a few questions for the speaker. Her name's Lila Watson, and she's kind of an activist, but she said, if you have come here to help me out, you're wasting your time. But if you've come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. And this guest speaker shared this with our students at the start of the semester. And I think it even came up in some student papers where they were tasked with, I believe it came to 15 hours of service learning. And we called it service learning because we wanted the students to think about not simply the acts of charity that they'd be engaging in, but to do real theological reflection on the experience. But I think some of them still, and maybe this is maybe a misunderstanding of the quote, I think it is, but they felt like, well, this is an assignment for us to do charity, but it really doesn't get at the kind of structural issues that maybe have set back the people that we're working with.
Right, and what starts to be interesting to me in all of this, especially since the time of year that we're in, everybody's starting to think of policies. We're thinking about voting for presidents, and even though actually a lot of the votes about policies that really affect people happen in the intervening years, we kind of bring all of these things up when it comes time to talk about presidents and presidential candidates. So there's an idea about like, well, if the policies can't change, how can anything really change? And, this gets into wider debates about, there are no magic bullets with policy either. And sometimes I think we want there's a way in which working with people very directly can make us think that policies might change, because if you give your time and charity and you try to give service to people, one of the things that we really always point out with our students is you're probably going to be really disappointed with the efficiency of all of it. There's a way in which you hear about the difficulties of the world and the sadness of the world, and it raises pity in your heart. And so you go, well, I want to go do something about this. And especially if you live in a certain economic world and have lived there for a while, if you have a problem, you go find the person who's good at solving it, you pay them to do it, and you expect it to be done, so much so that if it doesn't get done, you're going to call and complain to the manager, right? I mean, that's how things work. And you can see people who expect the world to work that way. If I paid for something, it's because I'm trying to fix a deficiency or a problem, and if it doesn't work, I'm going to go find who did it wrong, and I'm going to find someone else to do something different. If you talk to enough people in lower classes, you'll begin to hear that they expect things not to work, actually. And you hear from them how amazed they are when something works the first time, that they didn't have to, take 13 swings at something, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the reason I say this is when we have students who encounter the world for the first time where it's not expected that everything should bat 1,000, they can get really frustrated. And you and I maybe took a little bit too much delight in pointing out that that's where the real learning begins. That first time you're extremely disappointed when people aren't as gracious as you think they should be, or that you give someone help and then they're right back, 2 days later, or things like this. And I think this goes back to what you're talking about. If pity rises up in your heart and you write the check because you want that emotion to go away, there's nothing more frustrating than the person you having pity on, that the remedy doesn't stick the first, second, through 10th time. But that starts to be, theologically, why we have to look at the cross and why it is that when we do charity and almsgiving, we have to think about it in terms of God having pity on us. God doesn't have pity on us because he himself can imagine being in a similar situation as us, because God has all he needs and God has no shadow of turning. But out of love and the fact that God has, by his own decision, made us his children, he feels pity on us because of that connection through his choice. And the patience of God, to think about not only through each individual life how patient he is, Bud, but to think about the whole scope of the divine economy of salvation history. The patience of God in taking pity on us and showing us charity, that should make us begin to think about the patience we need to show, because charity is not a quick fix. And almsgiving itself has to be given with no attachment for a return. This is where we start to hear the economic language from Jesus very specifically. The loan that you give the poor is actually the loan you give God. You actually hear this in Proverbs. You hear this in St. Ephraim the Syrian. You hear this in a lot of the early church. You're actually making an investment with God, and this is where Jesus says, store your treasures in heaven where, and he makes an economic argument. The return is awesome. You can never make an economic deal like laying your treasures up in heaven. And so we give without expecting return here on earth, because the return we will give is beyond 100-fold. It's an infinite-fold return, doing these things, loaning to the poor as if we're loaning to God. And if you start to do that, and you start to give up on the idea that you're doing this to suppress pity or to fix the world, but you're doing this out of gratitude towards the patience and pity that God has towards you, not only will you stop frustrating yourself so much, but we start to change the very lens in which we see the world. And this is where someone like Gary Anderson in his books, Sin, A History, and then Charity, will point out that you start to see in worlds, in civilizations very much marked by Christianity, that the poor start to be seen as a gift. They're giving a gift to you. Your capacity and ability to help them out is the gift they give you, because otherwise maybe you don't go to heaven except for the fact that there's the poor beggar that asks of you alms. And then you get this weird exchange. No longer is it the person giving alms that is the person in power that should be thanked. It's we who give alms who should thank the poor for the opportunity to give back to God. They live in that difficulty, and in a weird way, it's for our benefit. Because if they didn't need our alms, what would we be left to give towards God?
Well, and for us to step back and reflect and to talk about how do we structure society in such a way that the poor and vulnerable are taken care of to the best of our abilities, whether that's conversation about a just wage or how we even build the buildings that we live in, etc., that's a really worthy effort. On the other hand, there's a way where we can say, well, my giving doesn't matter because I just have so little. And you're only doing something worthwhile when you can make an extravagant gift. I know there's more than one place in the Gospels where Christ specifically warns against that. You know, the famous story of the guy who blows trumpets when he's giving.
Right.
And I may have been guilty of that before. Like, I'm going to stick a couple coins in here so that when it hits the gift basket,
kabang,
ching, 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 ching. Yeah. But then a woman just gives. It's the widow's mite. We get that term. For us, it maybe be. It's a really small coinage. We need our New Testament friends on right now to tell us exactly how much it was. But she gave out of the abundance of what she had, and Christ said that's more praiseworthy. In another passage, he says, even if you give a cup of cold water to one of these little ones who's my disciple, truly I tell you that person will certainly not lose their reward. And so there is something meritorious for us to say, I'm getting paid a teacher's salary, but I can still give out of the gifts that God has given me. And I just think we can't. Bo, I mean, to scratch an itch that I know you always have, but I think it is apropos to our discussion today. I think the key is skin in the game.
Yeah.
And when you look at the great saints, they close the gap between themselves and those for whom they have pity. For St. Francis, that involved kissing a leper because he had a kind of revulsion when he came into the company of those who were most despised in his society. And so you begin to see the saints where, for them, I think it's never a matter of, I'm going to drop money here and then walk away. It's always like, for them, recognizing their own poverty and their own vulnerability and their relationship to those who are most in need was caught up in their own salvation. So
I agree. I'll get to the actual serious part, but you were talking about dropping the coins loudly in the collection plate. This reminded me, and it's some priest in Wichita. I think he's passed on. He is an older priest, but evidently he would pass around the collection plate. They'd bring it up. He'd get it, and he'd shake it, and he'd go like, "Too many croutons, not enough lettuce."
We're sending this back around.
And he would send it back around because he's like, there's not enough cash. There's too many coins. Sorry,
if there's ever been a second collection,
yeah,
you guys can blame me because I was throwing in the croutons, thinking that would draw attention to myself, but it actuy.
Man, I love that.
The opposite effect.
Too many croutons, not enough lettuce. But skin of the game wise to actually get into it. So there's a question that people will throw out and go, and it's funny because this is a very technical moral argument that a lot of people will get into without realizing it. But they'll get this idea that if you give to others with any sort of hint of self-interest, then it's not meritorious. What you've done is just selfish, and you throw it right out. And of course, when people do this, they're talking like Immanuel Kant, of course, the very famous German philosopher, who made this exact argument that if you get anything out of what you do, it's no longer moral. It's not bad necessarily, but it's amoral. Things should be done only out of duty, he says. None of it should be done for your own benefit. Now, this is crazy. Sorry, everyone who likes Kant, because we're creatures of love, of desire. I mean, this goes back to Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas, the whole gospel, that no, actually we do things because we love things, we have desires for things, and the highest moral is to love what is good. It might be the case that sometimes we have to fake it till we make it. There might be days where we wake up and we love our children, but we don't love how much noise they're making, and it's hard for us to show that love. There's all sorts of ways in which what I'm not saying is you should only do something if it makes you feel good. But certainly what we want to say is that the highest moral accomplishment is to love what is good, to love God, to love giving to the poor. And of course, love takes time. It has to mature. You have to, get in the habit of it. But it's certainly not the case that love isn't self-interested. Charity is self-interested. And in fact, the brilliance of the order of God is that he's made it where our self-interest is the interest of others. Indeed, our highest self-interest is to be interested in the weakest among us. This is a superior ordering of the world above all other orders. If this is triumphalist, I don't care, because Christ has made the world where our greatest self-interest is to care about the weakest among us. Think about the brilliance of that order, that to truly care about yourself is to care about others first and the weakest among us most. Think about how wedding those two things together is a brilliant way to order the cosmos. But the God who became man and died on the cross so that he may be raised and all of us may be raised, that's what he did. And that's the truth, is that your greatest self-interest is to care with total self-interest for the interest of others. That's why he put pity so deep as an emotion in our soul that drives us to do so much. And that skin in the game, we're taking this from Nassim Nicholas Taleb. We could probably do a whole show on that some other time. But he makes the point that plenty of people will benefit from risks in life, whether this is the stock market or business decisions or military choices, that they will take the benefits from risk, but they offload the downside to other people. I always throw out that the banking crisis of the 2007-2008 time period, supreme example of this. People made loads of money risking other people's money, but then when the whole thing fell apart, they had ordered the system so that all of the risk fell on other people and not themselves. They had no, as Taleb says, skin in the game. When it comes to charity, it's exactly what, like you're saying, Bud. When we give abstractly to kill the pity in us because we're uncomfortable with the feeling of pity, we have no skin in the game. In fact, it's like we're writing a check to have no skin in the game. Hey man, I don't want to actually feel your pain. I'm uneasy that I have pity on you. Here's a check so I don't have to feel those feelings and have no skin in the game in your life. But charity and almsgiving is where we give money to say, I am now going to wrap up my economic life, because economic life is part of our life. The church does not act like money's one thing and then spirituality is another. No, that's why Christ talks about salvation so much in economic terms. Almsgiving is to say, I'm wrapping up my ability to sustain myself with your life. And that's the difference, but I think that's ultimately the way that we make a distinction here. If you write checks in order to have no skin in the game and to kill pity in you, that is morally deficient. But if you give money either directly to a person or to an organization in such a way as to wrap your life and your success up in that person or in that organization, that's almsgiving. That is truly charity. That is truly the mirror of God's love towards us.
I think all of what you're saying about self-interest and wrapping ourselves up in the lives of others, it ultimately ties back to how we see God. And there's a certain way that we could say God could have saved humanity by remaining at a distance and setting things right without entering into our reality. That's not what God did. God sent his only Son, who became incarnate, who took on human flesh, who knew every aspect of human existence. I grew up in a context where I was told God intends to save you, but there's nothing that you can do. It's just ultimately a work that God does apart from your own agency.
Right.
And I think that narrative was well-meaning, but there is a way where we think we're having this kind of humility or that we're making things completely dependent upon God. But the salvation that God intends for us, for the entire world, it's not something that's done separately from who we are. So it's not like when I get to heaven, as I was told by some Sunday school teachers, that God will, like, Jesus will stand between me and the Father, and he won't see me, he'll only see his Son. If that was the case, my own transformation would be set to the side. And so even though I may think I'm being humble, I'm really maybe unintentionally trying to avoid the purgation that's involved. And so when we enter into the lives of others with this kind of almsgiving, with the kind of level of sacrifice that you're talking about, Bo, like you said, there is self-interest there, but the self-interest that's involved won't be painless. It will ultimately be the total renewal of who we are, and then that ties back to with what God intends for all of creation.
No, yeah, and this very last part of the show, I guess that I want to agree with you by saying one of the things that appealed to me most about being Catholic was purgatory. There's so much about the Catholic Church that people go like, oh, that must have been hard for you as an evangelical to wrap your mind around. But purgatory made absolute sense to me. The first sort of break I ever had, and I don't think I ever like completely went away from the church. I always believed in God and things like this. But during, some of those college years where you're, believing Lord knows what, I think that was part of the issue is, if God could be distant, then, why do you need to go to church? Why do you need to do these things? It's just sort of like an imposition of grace. But the idea that purgatory could start in the here and now, and that I didn't have to stay how I was and God just ignore it, but that truly I could change and become part of the body of Christ, that I can be hidden with Christ in the heart of God. Everything else fell away because I wanted to be a part of a church that believed that. And everything about almsgiving and charity is wrapped up into that. You give because it's in your self-interest, like you said, to become part of the body of Christ. And what a wonderful act of charity and mercy that is, that God himself did that for us.
Yeah, and like I was saying, we have to recognize that we're being caught up into this, that for the all-powerful God of the universe, for the Creator to involve us as co-creators, that's not God. That's not making less of God. That's God stooping down and drawing us up. And so we don't take anything away from the glory or the dignity of God by the fact that he involves us in that entire work.
Absolutely, Bud. Well, it's been a great show, so thank you all for listening. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, in our families, our city, our state, the nation, the world, the galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. This is The Uncommon Good, and we'll be back next week.
The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr is heard every week on wonderful Catholic stations like this one, and anytime on podcast. Just search for The Uncommon Good.